What is the most disturbing thing you saw on TV? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. The beheading of Nicholas Berg, the American businessman working and kidnapped in Iraq. On Chinese TV news while I was visiting China in 2006. The whole thing was shown rather than just the still image of a person with a black bag over their head. It was quite shocking and unexpected coming from Canada, where these extreme violent events are not shown on network TV. Answer: I worked on the presidential campaign in southeastern PA a short time later. I was spending election day driving around with this very nice gentleman giving out water and snacks to people who were in line waiting to vote because there was an unprecedented turnout. I noticed that some people had a really emotional reaction to seeing him, and I wondered why, only to discover it was Nick's dad I was riding around with. Story 2. Watching Nodar Kumartashvili from Georgia die instantly at the 2010 Vancouver Olympic Games in a practice run leading up to the men's luge event. I've seen other sporting deaths on TV, like Earnhardt, Senna, but their crashes didn't seem like they were going to be anything but minor injuries. Hearing the clink thud of Nodar in that concrete post is a sound I'll never get out of my head. Answer: I was at the Daytona 500 race where Earnhardt died, and sitting about 30 rows up in that final turn where it happened. It didn't look like much at all. He grazed the wall and then bounced off it. A buddy who was with me who disliked Earnhardt said, "Good knocked him out of the race." We immediately got up and headed out and left, as that was the final lap, and it took us about 4 hours to get home, and we didn't realize that Earnhardt had died till we turned on the TV later that night. My buddy started literally sobbing and saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I didn't want him to effing die." Story 3. The TV reporter in Roanoke, VA getting shot live during her report by a deranged, disgruntled ex-employee. Several other things mentioned as well, Challenger, none. 201 are also in my memory bank, but they were already mentioned. Story 4. It was on Shepard Smith's show where they had a car chase and the guy bailed and shot himself live on TV. I remember well how Shepard was yelling at the control room to cut, but they didn't get it fast enough, and the tragic end made it live on air. I remember he was absolutely furious, and he actually sincerely apologized. It wasn't a cookie-cutter apology either. You could tell he was furious, and he felt this was way out of line for TV news. Not a lot of journalists or anchors like him anymore either. Story 5. The earliest disturbing TV memory I can remember is news footage of Carl Wallenda, famed tightrope walker, falling to his passing in San Juan in Puerto Rico in 1978. They showed him falling and hitting the ground. I had just seen him perform at a circus a few years earlier. Story 6. Weapon. And then realization that the debris I saw falling from the towers were people jumping from many stories up. Sure enough. Answer: if any young Redditors are reading this and have only experienced 911 through secondhand accounts, or if you're like me and were too young to fully understand what everyone felt that day, this video is an incredibly eerie piece of journalism. It's a real-time dashboard that shows live news footage, airline data, civilian footage, first responder calls, and trackers for every single event before, during, and after the 911 attacks. I remember finding it on YouTube one night, not thinking it'd sit through the entire 4-hour thing, but I had been so young at the time of the attacks, and I was curious, so I clicked on it and ended up staying up until 4 a.m. to finish it. I was instantly mesmerized by how normal the news broadcast was in the hour or two leading up to it, and it was like a horror movie slowly seeing the planes get hijacked, the airline communications begin, and slowly tracking the planes making their way to New York, all while regular news topics and advertisements played along like a time capsule for 2001. Once the attacks began and continued through the collapse of the towers, the realization and sadness of what all transpired that day really sank in for me. I remember the newscasters mentioning how paper debris was falling from the buildings and having the sinking realization that these people couldn't comprehend it was actually people falling in that moment. Story 7. Clint Malarchuk getting his throat cut by a hockey skate. You could watch the blood squirt while his heart beat. Only reason he survived was because the trainer was a Vietnam vet medic who stuck his fingers into Clint's throat and pinched the artery shut. Story 8. The dead bloated bodies left in the streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. That was the most messed up thing I'd ever seen, and I lived through Vietnam War coverage and other atrocities. Story 9. Narni Ibrahim. About 10 years ago, there was a report on the Ebola crisis in Africa. News crews were following Médecins Sans Frontières. There was a film of a little boy bleeding from the eyes, lying on his back and screaming, and the voiceover said both his parents died and there was no one to stay with him as he passed away. It proper shook me. Story 10. Grew up in a country in Central America where they do not censor the news. A 1-year-old baby had gone missing, and the news was showing live footage of the search. The body was found in a muddy swamp, and I watched as they wrested the body out and hoisted it up by its leg. Story 11. 20-ish after the earthquake in Haiti, I was watching the news and there was a group of people trying to pull somebody out from under a collapsed building. The camera zoomed in, and the people pulled until the person came apart. Story 12. Challenger and 9/11. The final day of the siege on Meti Carmel in Waco, the federal building in OKC. The footage of the cowards in Uvalde standing in the hallway listening to children being taken down. The TV station putting up a sign saying sounds of children screaming has been removed. I'm a teacher in Texas. That one hit hard. Answer. That last one really gets under skin. All those fat jerk cops playing games on their phones with Punisher logos on the back, doing absolutely nothing while kids are down the hall, screaming in terror for their mothers and then being slaughtered. Then to have the audacity to arrest and continue to harass anyone who tried to hold them to account. Each and every one of those cops could die a slow and painful passing, and I would feel absolutely no sympathy. Story 13. The war in Vietnam. I used to watch the news with my dad. I credit Walter Cronkite with making me a pacifist. To paraphrase Hawkeye Pierce, war isn't hell. War is far worse than hell because there are no innocent bystanders in hell. War is nothing but innocent bystanders. Story 14. The Boksburg explosions of 24th on December 2022. I watched live as people walked up to the fuel truck to film or try to steal some fuel, and then the truck exploded. The bodies were everywhere, skin burned off. There was a man walking around screaming, "I'm burning," and someone saying to him, "Go to the hospital, man." Answer. People in South Africa have run out of empathy. You wouldn't understand it until you live it. Nobody helps. We just stand around and watch. Hard to imagine, I know, but it's because of an accumulative effect from seeing the country literally go down the shitter. The Gulf is run by incompetent assholes who have carried away everything but the toilet seat. If you haven't had firsthand experience from this country, you will not understand it. We are past the point of corruption fatigue. It's taken a toll mentally on all of us. You cannot keep caring if the cup is empty, and it's been empty for a while. Story 15. I was watching a college basketball game, and they cut out to a live feed of the raid at the Waco compound. I saw a couple of ATF agents get shot and collapse before they ended the feed. During the riots after the Rodney King trial, CNN was live, and I got to see Reginald Denny get hacked out of his truck and beaten. Before immigrating, the atrocities during the Troubles were always on the TV. Story 16. Everything I saw on 911. Second tower getting hit, people jumping from the towers, both of them falling, the Pentagon getting hit, and my brother works there. I still have nightmares about that day. Answer. Yeah, watching victims' final moments on live television is why I've always had a difficult time finding humor in jokes about the attacks. I try not to judge, but when younger people who were too young to understand what was happening or not even born yet or callous assholes joke about 911, all I can think of is those victims who had two choices, burn or jump. I watched them make their decisions in real time, and that affected me in a way many will never understand. I can't laugh about it. Story 17. Columbine shooting broadcast on CNN. Not from inside, obviously, but I specifically recall seeing kids running for their lives from the school. The news crews showed up quick to that scene and were waiting to see how everything would play out. This was before everyone was all jaded about school shootings, so it was pretty shocking to see. I happened to be celebrating 420 and was channel surfing and thought I was watching a movie at first. Now the national news probably wouldn't bother covering it live. Answer. I was in middle school when the Columbine shooting happened, and I lived less than an hour's drive from that school. I was at my friend's house after school, and we turned on the TV, saw that there was a live news thing happening. It was after the shooters were dead, but they were still sweeping the school for bombs. I just have this memory of seeing high schoolers who'd been cleared and put on buses to get out of there, sticking their heads and arms out of the windows, others running up to them on the sidewalk to grab at their hands. Everyone trying to find out whether their friends were still alive and to make those connections in the chaos. At the time, it was deeply shocking. I wish it still were. Story 18. 1, 9/11 people jumping to their deaths, the second plane hitting. 2, 2006. I was in China when they broadcast the execution of Saddam Hussein and the aftermath of an angry mob tearing at his body. 3, 2011 Tohoku tsunami. Story 19. October 1981. The assassination of Anwar Sadat. I saw the unedited feed, everybody did at least once. A guy had his arm cut in half, shot right off by a machine gun. Story 20. UPS driver being shot live on TV. I saw the blood spray everywhere inside the truck. It was the chase in Fort Lauderdale, where the jewelry store had been robbed and the thieves then carjacked the UPS truck with the driver inside and led police on a chase from Miami into Fort Lauderdale. I was in the hospital the day after giving birth to my son, and my husband was on his way back from our apartment with some stuff, and he was on the same road the chase was on. I had popped on the TV in the room, and the news happened to be on, and the chase was being shown live. I called him immediately and let him know what was going on. And almost as soon as I told him, the truck got stopped at that intersection, cops started pouring out of cars and hiding behind civilian vehicles, and everyone opened fire. Someone in the truck got hit. I saw the blood go everywhere, and then it cut to the news anchors. I was holding my day-old son in my arms. I'll never forget that. Story 21. Oddly, it's two actual black and white photographs from the past. During some sort of documentary on Jack the Ripper, they showed the real photograph of his last victim as they found her. The picture is taken from across the room. Her body is lying on the bed against the far wall, which is splattered with blood. You can sort of see her head and shoulders at one end of the bed and her feet at the other end of the bed, but there is just so much missing in between. I still can't forget that. I can see it right now. The other one that sticks with me was something about the Civil War and the medical facilities for the wounded. In it, they showed a photograph of one of the hospital tents. In the corner of the tent was a huge pile of amputated arms and legs. Can't forget that one either. Story 22. This ad from a German gardening store that portrays a bunch of bugs having intimacy. And then it zooms out to a lady who is gardening while having the biggest smirk on her face. Story 23. In a 2004 remake of the Helter Skelter movie, the killings were portrayed way too graphically. I was actually shocked that they allowed it to be shown on network television. Story 24. Any highway patrol safety video from the 60s. Lots of close-ups of internal organs strewn across the road, decapitated heads, and a dead baby. Story 25. Brian Douglas Wells having the neck bomb explode while police held him at gunpoint. Jonestown. Media carts were rolled into my 8th grade algebra class. I have no idea why they thought we should see the first aerial shots of 900 dead people. Story 26. When I was 10, my insane mother made my sister and I watch a cat be put to sleep on a vet show. We were both sobbing and begging her to let us look away, but she said we had to because it would happen to our cats someday. I'm 31 and she did so many awful things to us, but this still comes back to me. Story 27. The tsunami that hit Thailand a few years back with the guys filming from a seaside balcony and the water overtaking everything and everyone in its path. 911 as I watched from across the river. TV sucked for weeks after that. Challenger explosion as we watched in the school auditorium. Sandy Hook. I wondered why so many cop cars were racing past me on the way to work. Got in and immediately turned on the TV to see the horror. Hurricane Katrina. Story 28. One of the cable channels does a series of films about Hitler Nazis. The concentration camp scenes are always horrible. Always remember. Story 29. Old enough to have seen the Challenger, my dad called to tell us to turn on the TV, the Challenger exploded, and my little brother, who took the call, ran upstairs and told my mom not to turn on the TV because it will explode. So we didn't know about it until my dad came home from work. Later on in 7th grade, my physics teacher was a semi-finalist to be on the Challenger, but didn't make the final cut. Story 30. Watching a car chase that ended out in the desert, dude wrecked the car, got out to run, stopped and shot himself in the head. Leave TV. Story 31. When mad cow disease was first being reported, they filmed a cow who couldn't stand up being removed from a barn. They did it with a bucket plow, and the cow had a completely terrified look in his eyes. Probably still went to the meat processing plant. Also inside an industrial pig barn, they filmed how cruel the workers were to the animals. One being punched in the face and had cigarettes put out in its face. I wish that I had never seen these, as the images are forever burned into my memory. Answer. For me, it is a documentary about fur and how it's been harvested in Rusland. They skinned the animals while still alive. Can't get the images out of my head of the mountain of skinned animals, of which a lot of them were still alive. You could see them blinking, and the blood dripped slowly from their faces. They zoomed in on the still living, skinned animals. It was gruesome, and it still haunts me. Don't know the name of the documentary. It was about 20 years ago. Never. Story 32. Brady getting shot in the head during the Reagan assassination attempt and bleeding all over the street scared the heck out of little me. Story 33. The 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, that eliminated around 250,000 people. The number of people who died is what made me so disturbed. So sad. Here's Story 34. The space shuttle blowing up. Not 911, because I was in Manhattan. I was on the subway when the planes hit, but I observed the rest of it with my own eyes. Story 35. While technically not on TV, the footage of the 2003 Station nightclub fire on YouTube. I had seen it before, but it was the second viewing that I noticed the screams of the people trapped inside. Those screams were burned into my brain for a while, for a lack of a better description. Story 36. Live on-scene coverage of the 1986 Cerritos, Aeromexico crash. Footage had a reporter giving updates on camera while a body part was on somebody's roof in the background. Later live footage of the reporter in that location showed a large yellow bag where the body part had been. Story 37. A lot of terrifying stories in here. For me, it is Putin's speech about the war starting. I am from Russia. Me and my family didn't know how our lives would turn out and if we will be alive after all. Story 38. Live updates while the Christchurch shootings happened in New Zealand. It felt so unreal watching something like that unfolding here. Story 39. We had one of those giant satellite dishes, and we could get live news feed on it. I watched the aftermath of the earthquake in San Francisco, the people fleeing the baseball game, a police officer on a motorcycle going off an elevated highway. It was disturbing. Story 40. Two things. The news when the McDonald's massacre happened back in 1984. They showed the bodies of the dead kids and their bikes outside of the building. The second one was the aftermath of the walkway collapse at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City in 1981. They showed close-up footage of severed limbs, and you could see other crushed limbs hanging out of the wreckage. Pure nightmare fuel for a kid. Story 41. As a Norwegian, the newscasts all day at July 22nd. Most of the day, nobody knew what the hell happened, and we just got reports of children dying. Nothing like that had happened since Webby went on Norwegian soil, so it was pretty haunting. Story 42. The reporter and her cameraman eliminate on TV in 2015. That was 4 months before my husband was eliminated in the San Bernardino terrorist attack. Story 43. Early in the COVID pandemic, there were mass graves shown on TV in New York's Hart Island, and the realization of how bad things got so quickly. Story 44. Bud Dwyer ending things on live TV during a press conference. Challenger explosion's second twin tower getting hit. Jan 6th, I'm sure I'll get downvoted for this one, but I was legitimately worried we were about to go into civil war. I was legitimately scared. Story 45. Bud Dwyer do what he did. I was home from school that day for some reason. I was also only 8 years old. Story 46. Sitting in our classroom with my high school teachers while we watched the local police raid a student's house and remove a stockpile of guns and weapons to open fire on my school. Story 47. I'm glad things turned out okay, but when Hamlin went down in Bills vs. Bengals last year, it was really upsetting. The whole bar just went silent for hours thinking he was dead for sure. Story 48. 911, but in particular, whatever channel I had one, showed a jumper hitting the ground. You basically just see a solid mass hit the ground and explode and red mist everywhere. Story 49. I remember seeing a dead man floating in the news coverage of the Hurricane Katrina aftermath. Being 9 years old, it really messed with me. I had nightmares for a week about it. Story 50. I'm going to be the not me but person, so I apologize in advance. My dad once told me he watched a reporter die in the 70s. Apparently the guy was pleading for his life, saying stuff like, I have a wife, I have children, before he was shot. One of the only times I saw my dad cry was when he was describing this. Story 51. Take down on live TV. When Lee Harvey Oswald, suspected JFK assassin, was shot in the gut by Jack Ruby. In a basement crowded with police, reporters, and looky-loos, Ruby pushed through and jammed his gun straight at Oswald. My dad and I were watching, and we both jumped to our feet. Story 52. The Oklahoma City bombing. Everything about it, including the firefighter carrying the deceased little girl. It's my first memory of a tragedy. Story 53. I was at my grandma's when I was a kid watching Animal Planet, I think. This hunter trapped this mother wolf, skinned her, then hung out her skin so the pups could find it. I was only 7 and will never forget those pups crying and smelling their mother's hanging skin. And I wish I was old enough or could remember why. Story 54. Live TV coverage of a hostage incident in Dayton, Ohio, early 80s. The perpetrator had a gun taped to his hand and took a guy hostage in front of a bar. Almost every cop in town shows up. The victim, Judo, flips the guy with the gun and quickly runs off, and the cops opened up on the bad guy. Dozens and dozens of rounds, and that was teach you into that. Story 55. As a show threads in the news Grenfell, that was just so utterly heartbreaking. It wasn't long after the Ariana Grande concert bombing too, so we were all just so upset regarding that. Story 56. Local coverage of the Michigan State University shooting. My cousin, whom I've always been very close to, studies and lives there on campus, so seeing the whole thing unfold on live television while my cousin was texting me and updating me in real time as well was just gut-wrenching. You'll never forget just the complete fear and hopelessness I felt watching the injury passing numbers rise and stuff, and the constant wondering if my cousin was alive when he wasn't on his phone. I'm a grown jerk, man, and I sobbed watching all of that go down. Thankfully, my cousin is physically okay, but shootings are one of those things you don't think will happen in your community or affect your personal life until it does. Story 57. The 1992 Los Angeles riots. Reginald Denny getting shot in the head on live TV. Someone smashing a brick on him, then dancing in celebration. The dude was just driving his work truck and trying to provide for his family. Story 58. Owen Hart's passing. It wasn't directly on the camera, but you knew what happened, and it was on live TV at the time. For those who don't know, Owen Hart was a Canadian professional wrestler with the WWF at the time. As part of his gimmick as the Blue Blazer, he would wear blue wrestling gear with a mask and a cape, and they would lower him down from the arena rafters down into the ring on a cable with a harness. The harness had a quick release mechanism, so once he got down, he could unclip quickly to do the match, etc. He was having troubles with getting the clip undone, so they changed to some other quick release style. When it was time to be lowered down, they say his cape interfered with the clip, and it came undone right as he was letting go, and he fell to the ring, where immediately he started bleeding internally, very badly. He even tried to sit up, like to get up and shake it off, but he fell back. He essentially drowned in his own blood. He was stretchered out and pronounced dead, I believe, once he got to the hospital. The commentary team basically had to explain what happened, and the crazy thing to me is that they continued the show. Once they got word that Owen had passed, Jim Ross, commentary team, had to tell the live audience at home that Owen had passed away while the show was still going, and guys still had to go out there and wrestle, waiting to hear on their co-worker and friend. I've also heard that one of the crew members up in the rafters with him at the time said at least one of them heard the clip open, but by the time they could say anything, he was already on his descent. Of course, there's conspiracies that Vince McMahon, the owner of the WWE up until recently, had it planned to happen as a way to get back at the Hart family for something in the past, but I try not to look into that stuff too much. I was just a little kid then, as this happened in the mid-late 90s, was watching it live with my dad. He told me a couple years ago he was so frustrated at the time that they kept the show going, and he had to explain that to his young son what had happened. I mean, yes, you could change the channel, but at the same time, you want to know if he was going to make it or not, you know? It was just an overall tragedy all around and shouldn't have even happened to begin with. Him and his wife were still young themselves and had young kids at home. Were building a big new house at the time, as Owen would have went on to make millions over the years. Him and his brother Brett were at the top of their game really at that time. Definitely one of the worst things I've seen as a kid. Story 59, fictional. When Dollarhide bit the guy's lips off graphically on the show Hannibal. I had read all of the books, so I knew that happened, but I did not expect NBC to go that far. Story 60. The Human Centipede South Park episode still haunts me to this day. I cannot even fathom what the actual Human Centipede movie is like. Are people who watch that for fun, okay? Story 61. Watching the space shuttle explode still lives with me. It was immediately obvious it was gone, but I still waited to hear the confirmation. Krista McAuliffe's parents were on screen the whole time. Story 62. I saw an interview with a young porn star and her manager who was also her stepdad. He came into her life when he was 5 and said he knew she'd grow up to be sexy when she was 6. He watched her perform and went with her to get waxed. During the interview, she had this vacant smile and described herself as a slut as he grinned. It was nauseating. Story 63. In my life, I've seen on TV Space Shuttle Challenger explode while sitting in my 3rd grade classroom. Children fleeing the gunman at Columbine, while police surrounded the building, and did nothing. Children screaming at Uvalde while police surrounded the scene and did nothing except keep parents away. Los Angeles police officers beat and kick a man nearly to passing, then watch those same officers walk free. The Jonestown mass, tragic end aftermath. Reagan and bystanders being shot by Hinckley. Wildlife covered in crude after the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Alaska because the captain was tipsy. A passenger plane crashed into Tower 2. The immediate aftermath of a federal building blasted apart by alt-right domestic terrorists. The terrifying images coming from Chernobyl. A massive shootout between the LAPD and two heavily armed and armored bank robbers that literally went on for almost an hour. Countless images of combat and war crimes from across the globe. Story 64, 900-911. Nothing will ever be as intense or as incredibly powerful as seeing that live on TV. The presenters across the channels were so compassionate and confused. It is seared in the memory of all who saw it. I recently visited Ground Zero. Nothing could prepare me for how raw and compelling that place is. May the souls of all rest peacefully. Story 65. Long time ago, I set the VCR to tape a documentary about tsunamis. Instead, it was a show about a school shooter. This was over 20 years ago, and I still remember exactly how fudge disturbing it was. I was maybe 13. Story 66. Probably when Bud Dwyer shot himself at a press conference in 1987. The news showed the footage of him pulling the trigger and slumping to the floor. They didn't pan away when the blood kept flowing out of him. Story 67, 911. I know it seems kind of unreal now, 20 years later, but while that was unfolding in real time, it was easily the most horrifying thing ever broadcast. Story 68. Like many others, 9/11. The second tower getting hit live, and the people jumping out of windows 1,000 to 300 meter from the ground. There are many horrific things and footage from wars that are shown on TV, but this being live seared it in my brain in a different way. Story 69. 10 years old watching Jack Ruby shoot Oswald, a bullfighter getting gored on a UHF channel from Tijuana when I was 15, and the plane hitting the second tower. Story 70. I was very upset watching people waiting for help in the stadium after Hurricane Katrina and help not arriving. There was someone in a wheelchair with a blanket over them who had passed away. Elderly people trapped in hospitals with no way to evacuate. The coverage was just searing. The people that lived through that must still be traumatized. Awful, awful time. Story 71. Not something many in here will know about, but the British Canadian Tommy Cooper having heart attack and dying live on stage at the Royal Variety Show in 1984. I was only a kid, and he'll never forget it. Story 72. Daniel V. Jones in 1998. He was diagnosed with HIV and cancer and took his life on the freeway in LA. He used a Molotov cocktail and set himself on fire, ran out, then blew his head off with a shotgun. His dog was trapped in the car and died in the fire. The whole thing was broadcast live. Story 73. The Walking Dead scene when Negan beats Abraham and Glenn to passing with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Story 74. Apart from real events, of course, I made the mistake of watching Sybil when I was in 8th grade. My mother had warned me against it, so I went behind her back. Story 75. Either the second tower being hit or the Challenger. We watched that live in class. My 2nd grade teacher, who was my teacher at the time, was one of the candidates who could have been on the shuttle. Story 76. The aftermath of the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 in Washington, D.C. I remember the rescuers trying to pull survivors out of the icy Potomac and the half-frozen people not able to hang on. Story 77. I saw a man blow his head up during a high-speed chase live on TV. His truck went up in flames above his dog inside. I was in high school. I think about this often, mostly because of the pup. Story 78. The Boston Marathon bombing. It was probably the first big incident where everybody had cell phones capable of capturing and uploading video to the public, and news outlets were showing everything they could scrape up with no thought or care. One shot that haunts me was this wounded runner. They looked normal, but their legs ended around the knee and had what looked like broomsticks sticking out. The ankles, feet, and muscles were gone. All that was left were the bones. Story 79. One, I saw the second plane hit the South Tower on 911. I was watching Good Morning America, and they were doing a live feed about the first plane when the second plane flew into the cameraman's view, and they panned to it and showed it flying into the tower. 2 U.S. saw a man get shot on live TV after a high-speed North chase in Los Angeles about 20 years ago. Story 80. This was years ago. I turned it on in the middle of the show, so I don't have any context, but the detectives were walking down a street at night in a residential neighborhood. They opened a wooden gate to an alleyway and pointed their flashlight at a boy about 12 or 13. He was sitting on the ground and hugging his knees tight to his chest. He was dead. You could just tell he was terrified and alone in his last moments. I had to quickly turn the channel. I don't even know what show it was. Maybe 48 Hours. Story 81. I was 20 when Columbine happened, and I watched the entire thing on TV. Seeing that bloody kid jump fall out of the window of the school was horrifying. Story 82. I think in 1998, when I was 10, I watched a live speed chase on the local LA news that eventually ended with the suspect dying by tragic end. And it wasn't on a 7-second delay. Yeah, that was pretty disturbing to see. Story 83. My face, Jordan. On the news, completely unexpected. They were reporting on some new hotel at the center of our city, and I happened to walk past there on that exact day. I didn't notice the cameras. Story 84. We had been looking for my son's adult girlfriend, as she wasn't at our house or her dorm. We saw on local TV when they loaded her body onto helicopter life flight and recognized her car in the shot. Sadly, she passed on the way to the hospital. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Story 85. 911 Live. Worst experience as a 5th grader for me. It was a big deal for us in our city of Huntsville, AL, with all the research centers, with military contracts, as we were considered a top target for a secondary attack. Thank goodness that didn't happen. But we were released from school that day, and I remember my mom picking up my sister and me. It was traumatic, mainly because I couldn't really comprehend what exactly happened. I was perfectly fine being in the 5th grade bubble of being a kid. That day changed everyone's lives. But for me, it was upsetting to know there were people in those buildings and on the planes who knew they were not going to go home to see their families. I do pray this sort of thing never happens again. Story 86. Not actually real, but an UK anti-drink drive commercial from the 90s. It doesn't show anything horrific, but it really hit home. Story 87. Twist on the question. Back in like 2003, where I was living in Atlantic Canada, we were hit by a particularly serious hurricane that destroyed a lot of natural beauty. I had an English teacher who was a bit of an eccentric. Imagine Willy Wonka as an evangelical. And he got stopped for an interview by the morning news while walking his dog in the aftermath. Imagine a quaint cul-de-sac in the city with 200-year-old trees of all sorts and flowers and beautifully curated lawns. The aftermath of the hurricane had destroyed much of that, and the scene was fallen trees, ripped up lawns, and houses with severe damage. My teacher is just walking along happily. When they ask him how he feels about it, he just smiles and responds, "I'm delighted there's less leaves to sweep up," and keeps walking. Story 88. Watching a young man hurl himself out the window of Columbine High School during the massacre. They were broadcasting it on live TV. I was babysitting after school. Never can get it out of my mind. Story 89. No one expected the first tower to collapse on 911. The collective gasp in the room when we all saw it happen. The dread we all felt when the second one collapsed. Story 90. In 1982, 1983, when I was in 7th grade, they made us go home and watch the day after. It was about a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union and how it impacted a suburban community in like Kansas. This came complete with vaporization, fire, torched bodies, etc. This was on primetime network TV. Also keep in mind, in 7th grade, I was 12. I was very upset by this movie, and the discussion in school where they wanted us to watch it was not helpful. Propagandized talk about the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and nuclear weapons, and how they were made filled discussions all week. Story 91. Honestly, 911. I watched that live as the towers fell, and debris fell off the buildings beforehand. It wasn't debris, it was not debris. Story 92. An episode of Live PD from about 4 years ago. A police dog was sent after someone running, then came running back to his human partner. When he reached down to pet the dog, he had blood on his hand. The dog had been stabbed multiple times by the man he was chasing. When he lied down and started breathing heavily, his human partner started crying and yelled for help and begged the dog to hang in there and not die. I have tears in my eyes right now just typing this out. The dog survived and was retired, but that was absolutely horrible to see. Story 93. 911. Watched the second plane hit on TV. I was 18 and pretty sure I was going to go to war. Jan 6th. I just couldn't believe my eyes. Story 94. 2 things mainly from when I was a kid. 1, when I tried to watch The Dark Crystal for the first time, the Emperor's passing disturbed and scared me so bad that I started crying. turned off the film and refused to watch it for years afterwards. 2. I was watching one of those Walking with Dinosaurs documentaries, and I remember one scene that scarred me for life. A little baby dinosaur bird was hatching from its egg, but it caught the attention of nearby ants. The next scene cuts to the poor hatchling writhing and chirping in pain as it's being completely covered and eaten alive by ants. There were so many ants that you couldn't even really make out the hatchling anymore. Then it later cut to a bare skeleton of the animal with most of the ants having left. Edit. It turns out the second one was from Walking with Beasts, and it involved ants eating a Gastornis chick. It wasn't as dramatic, gruesome as I remembered it being, but still disturbing to watch nonetheless. I always get squeamish whenever I see ants swarming their food, especially if it's a dead animal. Story 95. Rentenheim. I witnessed federal agents setting fire to a building filled with women and children, and then I watched people on CNN, federal spokespeople, explain that it was something different, and while it was a shame, it was the Vice-President's fault and not a murderous federal government no longer worried about consequences. Story 96. News footage when a guy got in his car with his dog and set the car on fire as a form of protest. I think he got out and shot himself. It was the fire thing that I found most haunting. If I feel tragic end, I definitely won't burn my loyal, trusting pet alive. I can understand a person feeling hopeless and wanting their life to be over. I cannot begin to comprehend the dog torture aspect. Story 97. I was too young to remember 911 and the Challenger, but what shook me was watching a European news channel, don't remember which, and seeing the mass graves in the aftermath of the attack on Bucha in Mariupol in Ukraine. My family was executed during WW2 by the Soviets, and it's so scary to see it happening again. Story 98. Watching Challenger explode. We were in grade school watching it live for science class. We all wanted to be astronauts until that day. Story 99. On the morning of August 26, 2015, news reporter Allison Parker and photojournalist Adam Ward, both employees of CBS affiliate WDBJ in Roanoke, Virginia, United States, were fatally shot while conducting a live television interview near Smith Mountain Lake in Moneta. They were interviewing Vicki Gardner, executive director of the local Chamber of Commerce, when all three were attacked by a gunman in a mass shooting. Parker, age 24, and Ward, age 27, died at the scene, while Gardner survived. Video of the incident showed Parker conducting the interview when at least 8 gunshots were heard, followed by screams. Ward's camera fell to the ground, briefly capturing the image of Flanagan holding a Glock 19 9mm pistol. Story 100. It wasn't technically on TV, but I got all the way through the Netflix documentary series of the trials of Gabriel Fernandez. A lot of it was family members and the CPS workers and his piece of shoot mother and other adults in the courtroom or talking in interviews, but when they showed pictures of that poor baby in the hospital, holy fudge. In general, it was a sad case, as is any, but darn. Story 101. In Russia was one true crime series called Criminal Russia, show run on federal television primetime. Include uncensored footages of dead bodies, gore, descriptions of tortures, operative tapes and files, and much more. Iconic. Story 102. The X-Files episode Home. It's the only episode of the show I've ever seen. God, was that disturbing. Story 103. The falling man from 911 still lives rent-free in my head. Then to only find out how many people jumped. Story 104. Probably the last American plane leaving Afghanistan and seeing all the people clinging to the outside plummeting to their deaths. Story 105. When R. Bud Dwyer committed tragic end by a gun to the mouth at a press conference, I remember the news showing it uncensored. I was very little bit those images freak me out still. Story 106. I had a class where I was forced to watch on TV how a body got dissected. It was vivid, detailed, and lasted the entire day. The reason why it was disturbing was because it was the body of a teacher I knew who died 3 years prior and donated his body for science and study. The entire introduction area was also included on which parts of the body were edible and a descriptive cause on how he died. Half of the class got PTSD therapy, and the teacher giving the lecture was suspended. Story 107. I was like around 78 years old when the Bali bombing incident happened, and I remember vividly in the TV news, they show the bomber's decapitated body from chest up without censoring. Story 108. 911. I turned on the TV in time to see the second plane hit the tower. I thought it was a replay of the first hit, but I was wrong. I watched over time as the towers started swaying a bit and shaking. I knew they wouldn't last, and all I could do is hope people got out in time. Unfortunately, we know the rest. Story 109. Joe Rogan hosting Fear Factor, pushing contestants to drink donkey semen. Not kidding. The fact that show producers, network officials, the FCC, and sponsors thought it was a good idea is still astonishing to me. Story 110. I was a kid and in elementary school when we were all sitting around the TV watching the Challenger launch. Story 111. Timely response but true. Jan 6th. I thought I was watching the passing of the American Republic in real time. It was horrifying, and no one should ever forget the horrible, traitorous actions of that day. Story 112. The January 6th insurrection was pretty traumatizing to watch live. We were already reeling from the pandemic. Story 113. PBS showed an uncensored version of Scared Straight from 1978. In the middle of the day, it was a weekday after school. I was only in 6th grade. Story 114. The obvious answers are Challenger and 911. Outside of that, watching the pizza bomber thing on Evil Genius was so upsetting, and in fictional film, Dr. Sleep gave me serious PTSD and I turned it off. Story 115. Anar, in the 1960s, got home from school and was watching WNBC News from the city, and there was a report of hosing of black people in LA and Chicago, and I was watching and it showed these black men being hosed with fire hoses. These men flew, hit the wall, and looked dead. I was 14, and it was one of the pivotal moments in life where I become woke, to what was happening to African Americans in my country. Sad thing is that it could probably still happen 55 years later. Story 116. A documentary about cats and dogs, many of them stolen pets, being skinned alive in China and sold as fake fur in the West. I didn't make it far, turned it off when a guy started skinning a screaming dog alive, starting with the groin. Horrible. Absolutely horrible. Hugged my cat extra hard after. Story 117. A man being eaten by a pride of lions. To just see a giant predator chow down into the abdomen, crotch region of a man, while his left leg is flailing upright like the shot is from behind, like you don't see the lion actually taking a munch. You see a giant cat's back and backside. I don't remember how old I was. I don't remember if it was news or one of those shocking video shows that used to exist, but that triggered a phobia fear. Not sure how to put this. To this date, it's one of two horror tropes where it still manages to unnerve me. Giant creatures casually eating up a human. The weirdest thing is actual lion-like creatures, or similar size, let's say a werewolf. Don't make me squeamish. No, it's the T-Rex kind and up that do it for me. One bit or two, and you're gone. A whole life of brilliance. A snack for a predator higher on the food chain. Story 118. When I was a kid, I was watching afternoon cartoons. It suddenly switched to a news report of a guy who stopped on an overpass to protest. He had a sign that said, HMOs are in it for the money. After a long standoff, he shot himself in the head with a shotgun. Nothing was censored. Story 119. 911. That live bank robbery with the armored bank robbers who the news crew at the time thought were SWAT, forget details. Challenger disaster. Story 120. In 1987, a Pennsylvania politician shot himself on live TV. Had to look up the facts for specifics. I was 14 and don't remember why he did it. I remember I was home from school. The reason why, I have no idea. He was having a press conference. He apologized to his family and friends, then pulled out a pistol and shot himself. I remember my mom panicking that I saw that and quickly turned off the TV. Only thing I remember about him was his name. It was Bud Dwyer. After doing some fact-checking, I found he was about to sentence to 40 years in prison for bribery. Story 121. Probably Challenger. I was young and kept trying to get my mom to look at the TV. Was in basic training when 911 happened, so I never saw it. Story 122. 3 years ago today exactly, watching Americans rally up and openly attack institutions of American democracy, all guided and encouraged by an absolute doofus of a president that made the heels of the past, like W. or Quayle, look like Machiavelli. I worry about how many still appear to frequent the same cult of personality, even after having years of opportunity to revisit the events leading up to that day and the copious publicly available evidence to support a change of heart. Story 123. Some things from the war in the former Yugoslavia. Ceausescu's execution. The towers getting hit some ski race wherein racer died after falling in the race. Don't remember where, when, and who it was. I was probably a teenager. Story 124. A Canadian heritage break showing the graphic violation of an Indigenous woman. At like 4 p.m., I was in elementary school and it fudged me up for a while. My mom thankfully helped me cope, and she sent a lot of angry letters to CBC. Story 125. Evil Genius documentary. Was not expecting them to show the munitions going off around the guy's head. Really interesting documentary though. Story 126. The color bomb going off in Evil Genius. I watch a lot of crime docs, so I don't know if it's the most disturbing, but it certainly came to my mind first, and it's been a while since I've seen that doc. It was only a quick glimpse, and I don't recall any gore, but him yelling at everyone around him to help, saying the bomb was going to go off, is so sad and unsettling. Story 127. Challenger blowing up live as we watched packed gym full of elementary school kids. Everybody learned about passing that day. Story 128. I saw the second plane hit the tower on 911 Live, the Today Show. They were covering the first crash, and then suddenly there was a second. Story 129. 911 news coverage the day of the plane crashes with people jumping off the burning building. I will never get those images out of my head. Story 130. During 911, I was in high school and my mom pulled us out early because my sister was in 12th grade and worked at the airport gift shop and they'd grounded everything, so she had to report to work. My brother was in boot camp, so my mom pulled me out too. I was 15. We went to IHOP for lunch, and I distinctly remember coverage of people falling jumping from the towers and thinking, they're not going to make it, and couldn't believe they were showing it. Story 131. The first really disturbing thing I saw on TV was the Challenger explosion. Even though I was a space nerd, I was kind of half-heartedly watching until I saw the smoke billow out, and I knew immediately that it was not the SRBs separating. I sat bolt upright and thought my heart was coming out of my chest. Story 132. Seeing live footage from the helicopters of the dead teenagers and kids laying at the edge of the Utøya Island during the 2007 terrorist attacks in Norway in 2011. I was only 7 when it happened, but it does something to your brain. Rest in peace to all the lives lost in the attacks. Story 133. A dog that had been skinned alive for the dog-eating festival in China. It was on a pile of dog bodies and lifted its head and blinked. Wish I had never seen that. Story 134. Watching people fall to their passing during the 911 attacks. The sounds of them hitting the cars or the roof of the lobby was awful. Story 135. Probably the plane flying into one of the Twin Towers on 9/11/2001. I saw it on live TV. I was 1,000 miles from home. Story 136. The most disturbing thing I've ever seen on TV was the 2004 tsunami that devastated parts of Southeast Asia. It was a surreal and horrific event that left countless people dead and destroyed entire communities. Watching the footage of the waves overtaking buildings, cars, and people was a truly chilling and haunting spectacle. The scale of the tragedy was overwhelming, and it's something that will be etched into my memory for a long time to come. Story 137. That I saw live, 911 Challenger 1-620. That I saw later live on air, tragic end by gunshot by a TV anchor, Christine Chubbuck. Story 138. Downer cows when Katie Couric was doing the news. Turned me immediately into a vegetarian. The aftermath of Katrina in New Orleans. Dead bodies floating in the water and people on their roofs. Dogs abandoned in homes. Story 139. Utøya 2011, Norway's first ever terrorist attack on teens at summer camp. It started with a bomb in the capital, on the news everywhere. But then we quickly got the news of an active shooter outside the capital on a political summer camp. They showed live footage of kids swimming for their life from the island, and we could see others hiding on the cliffs to avoid the shooter. I remember those who got off the island just crying hysterically being held, be rescuers. It was so confusing and horrifying. Story 140. About 8 years ago, there was a terror attack of the headquarters of a French satirical magazine called Charlie Hebdo. Gunmen eliminate several people in the office and exited the building while being fired upon by French police. In the exchange of gunfire, a police officer is wounded. A terrorist runs up to the wounded police officer who is begging for his life and shoots the police officer through the head. The news forgot to blur it in the haste to bring the news. It still makes me sick to the stomach thinking about it. Story 141. Susan Smith pleading to the public for help on national television, saying that a black man had carjacked her and kidnapped her 2 children, 3 1 years old. Then it comes out she drowned those poor babies in a lake in her car. Maybe not the most disturbing, but it's stuck with me since 1994. Story 142. News reporter Allison Parker and her cameraman Adam Ward shot and eliminated by a deranged coworker on live TV. Story 143. Footage of the liberation of one of the Nazi passing camps. I was 8 and giving my grandma a manicure and did not get to the TV in time to turn the channel before the WDU history class, distance learning, came on. I tried to change the channel, but Grandma was like, "You're going to learn why the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi." And I did. Story 144. IDK, if this counts, I was young when this had happened, but the passing of Steve Irwin had me hugging the TV. That man literally changed my life, and I just can't never get the thought of him dead as reality. Story 145. In 2007, 2 news helicopters collided on live TV while following a high-speed police chase. I was watching Channel 3 with my favorite news guy in the chopper, narrating the unfolding events. Suddenly, there was a cry, spinning footage, and then static. It then cut to the news anchors in the studio looking very confused. The Channel 15 chopper collided into Channel 3. Eliminate everyone on board both choppers. Super needless loss of life, and it absolutely freaked everyone out. Story 146. I know it might not be a lot compared to like 911, but probably that explosion in Beirut a few years back. Explosions are often exaggerated in film and TV, so people think they know what an explosion is. But something about seeing it start from a fire, and then all in less than a second you see the shockwave reach whoever filming, followed by a deafening boom, engages a primal sense of dread for those who aren't aware of what a real explosion is like. Story 147. The Hillsborough disaster that was shown live in BBC One. Liverpool FC and Nottingham Forest were playing in an FA Cup semi-final game. I remember watching the heave of fans being led into the pens, and then fans starting to get pulled up by others in the level above, and the fans literally dying by suffocating. I remember seeing fans placed on advertising boards instead of medical stretchers. What has made it worse over the years was the cover-up and blaming of Liverpool FC fans for the disaster, only to be exonerated of any blame several decades later. Story 148. Maybe not the most disturbing, but certainly up there on the list of things I never expected to see on a news broadcast. The earliest coverage of 911, CNN showing people jumping from the building. They never looped back to some of that footage, and for good reason. Story 149. The BoJack Horseman episode, Time's Arrow. The best portrayal of generational trauma I've ever seen. Even when I do a rewatch, I'm always anxious as this episode approaches. It's a tough watch. Story 150. The passing of Tom Price. It was horrifying and traumatizing to see. Here's a link if you want to see it. Story 151. When that hockey player got his neck sliced with another player's skate blade, I can't watch hockey anymore because of it. It haunts me. Story 152. The WTC towers collapsing, watching the city of New Orleans drown, and the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Story 153. The country I live in electing Donald Trump as president. I knew people were stupid, but I never understood just how bad it's gotten. Story 154. Everyone else has mentioned the classics, so I am going to go with Christine Blasey Ford's testimony at Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. The look on her face towards the end just broke me. Story 155. I saw Challenger on live TV. I saw the 2 towers fall on live TV. I saw the orange cringe win an election. The last one is by far the worst. Nobody wanted the first one to happen. 20 or 30 people worked to make the second one happen. Millions contributed to the third one. That makes it the worst. Also passing toll worse too. Story 156. A U.S. president found guilty of intimacy assaulting a woman and is still allowed to run for president because the statute of limitations ran out to charge him in criminal court of law. To me, that's as disturbing. Engaging in an insurrection against our elections and still be allowed to run for president is disturbing. Supreme Court justices accepting very expensive gifts from conservative megadonors and not reporting to IRS and no consequences. Disturbing. That's just to name a few of the top most disturbing news presented on TV. Answer: I was freshly 18, cast my very first vote, and I was very confident after seeing my very first presidential debate that included Trump making period jokes about Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly that there was simply no possibility that such a man would ever be sworn in. I will never forget the nausea and terror I felt as I watched a crowd of frat boys celebrating outside my dorm window. This was only a few weeks after a violation case had shaken my campus, and I was so terrified for what this meant for me as a woman. Story 157. Back in the 70s, my friend's dad had a cigarette dispenser on his TV. You lifted the tail and the cigarette came out of the donkey's jerk. Story 158, probably POTUS DET saying I love you and you're very special right after a bunch of terrorists attacked the Capitol building. Story 159, Negan smashing people with his bat in The Walking Dead. The setup was so good too because they made you fear him before you saw him. Story 160, Dan Weldon's crash. Was always a big fan of his, but seeing that crash and then response to it, my dad and I both knew what it was. It was awful. Story 161, R. Bud Dwyer's tragic end. On January 22, 1987, R. Bud Dwyer, Pennsylvania State Treasurer, called a news conference in the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg, during which he fatally shot himself with a .357 Magnum revolver in front of reporters. Dwyer's tragic end was broadcast later that day to a wide television audience. I was 18 and saw it myself. Unbelievable. Story 162. I'm old enough to remember Bobby Kennedy being eliminated and can remember exactly where I was when other big events happened, but I didn't see any of them as they were happening. So the answer for me is 911. I got to work and my boss told me about what was going on. I went home and like so many others was glued to the TV. Story 163. Watching cartoons one afternoon in the early 90s in SoCal with my young kids, and the news broke in with a man who had blocked a freeway overpass to protest poor treatment from his health insurance company. Fortunately, my kids got bored quick and left the room before he shot himself in the head with a rifle or shotgun. The news folks hadn't seen that coming either, and hadn't turned off their live feed fast enough. It was so sad and awful. Story 164. I was in second grade when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So many moments from that day and the next few are indelibly etched in my mind. But undoubtedly the most shocking part I actually saw on TV was when the police were bringing Oswald in, and Jack Ruby stepped up and shot him in the gut. Right there, live on national TV. Story 165. Bud Dwyer in Harrisburg put the gun in his mouth and blew his brains all over the wall while speaking on live TV. Story 166. There was an HBO documentary years ago that showed footage of an inmate in a prison stabbing another prisoner to passing, and that visual has never left my mind. Story 167. The Challenger disaster as a toddler, though the full horror of it wasn't made apparent for decades. Edit. In person, though, I saw something more visceral. I was driving on the interstate, light traffic, nice day. I was passed by one of those little kit sports cars that used to be fairly popular. I was going 70 miles per hour, passed me like I was at a stoplight. About 30 minutes later, traffic comes to a standstill. I see there's state troopers waving people around what I assume was a truck with a popped tire. What it was a semi with that kit car under its rear axle and a dinner plate size splat on the bottom of the loading ramp. That was a few decades ago nearly, and I remember it with more clarity than most things in my life. Additional edit, I can't spell for crap.